Israel Adesanya just called out Dana White and the UFC for their horrible treatment of Francis Ngannou. And we're going to take a look at the clip. He did an interview with ESPN MMA. He stared dead into the camera and called out Dana White and the UFC for what they have done to Francis Ngannou. And I thought this was a perfect opportunity to look back at the Dana White Francis Ngannou saga, and we can zoom out and look at the full timeline. And I covered all of this extensively in real time, but now we have the benefit of knowing the future. So we're going to look back at some of the statements that Dana White has said. We're going to look back at some of the treatment that Dana White and the UFC has offered to Francis Ngannou, which has been quite frankly horrible. And then we're going to take a look at something they did recently in the lead up to UFC 305 that caused Israel Adesanya to finally call this out. And on top of all that, the main reason I wanted to make this video is because the majority of fans, UFC fans, Dana White sycophants, WME zombies, Zuffa zombies, whatever you want to call them, were just hanging on Dana's every word and going along with every false narrative that he would push about Francis Ngannou. And the media, the fans, there was little to no pushback. And I believe at least that portion of the MMA community got what they deserve when it comes to the UFC heavyweight division. And it's all because you guys went along with what Dana White did back then. We are paying for it right now in the current UFC, so we're going to break down that as well. So let's jump right into it. I want to take a look at a clip of Dana White talking about Francis Ngannou being released from his contract, which isn't even true. Francis Ngannou basically fought out his deal. He used a sunset clause to leave the UFC because he believed he was being unfairly treated by the UFC. And this is Dana White in the immediate aftermath. As soon as the Jon Jones-Ciryl Gane fight was announced or leaked by one of the, arenas or whatnot, this is Dana White in the immediate aftermath.
We had gotten to a point where, he was going to fight Jon Jones, and many who believe, including me, that he's the best of all time, for the heavyweight championship. And Jon Jones has been willing and ready and able to fight anybody. He didn't care who it was.
Jon Jones has been willing and ready and able to fight anyone. He didn't care who it was. I want you to remember that. I want you to remember that very, very vividly, what he just said.
Could have been anybody in the heavyweight division. He was ready to go. And Francis, we offered Francis a deal that would have made him the highest paid heavyweight in the history of the company. More than Lesnar, more than anybody. And he turned the deal down. So, I don't know. We get to this point where I've told you guys this before. If you don't want to be here, you don't have to be here. I think Francis is in a place right now where he doesn't want to take a lot of risk. Feels like he's in a good position.
He doesn't want to take a lot of risk. Remember that also, because we're going to call that out in a little bit as well.
Where he could fight lesser opponents and make more money. So we're gonna let him do that. We're going to release him from his contract. We're going to give up our right to match, and he can go wherever he wants and do whatever he wants.
So first off, I'm sorry for the people who have watched every video I've ever made about this. They're hearing some things the drum that I've been beating for 2 damn years, even longer really. But they did not release him. Francis Ngannou was able to complete his contract with the sunset clause. They basically held on to him to the very last day. And this was basically the very last day of his contract. So they did not release him. They fought and clawed and held him hostage, even though he was injured, so it didn't really matter that much. That's an outright lie. Now, in terms of Jon Jones was ready, willing, and able to fight anyone and everyone, and he was ready to go, already setting the narrative that Francis Ngannou is scared of Jon Jones. Well, that's just simply not true, because we also have this clip from UFC 260. This is right after Francis Ngannou folded Stipe Miocic like a lawn chair, brutally KO'd him, and won the heavyweight title. Let's listen to what Dana White had to say about Jon Jones versus Francis Ngannou. Let's listen to what he had to say, because remember, Jon Jones has always been ready and willing and able to fight whoever, whenever, blah, 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 so on and so forth. Let's listen to what he had to say after Francis Ngannou KO'd Stipe Miocic. By the way, just for context, in case you just started watching the sport in the last couple of years, the UFC Dana White and Jon Jones were in contract negotiations at this point in time as well. And that's exactly why Dana White is acting the way he is. I actually covered this when I first started my channel, but let's listen.
I'm going to ask you what appeals next, right? Because Stipe, we talked about it, greatest of all time. We said if he loses, he'd probably deserve a rematch, but man, the idea of a Jon Jones fight seems awfully exciting right now. And Jon came out, tweeted, said, show me the money. What appeals to you most? Because it seems like that would be an amazing super fight.
If I'm Jon Jones and I'm home watching this fight, I start moving to 85.
By the way, fuck the MMA media. That wasn't even funny. It wasn't even funny. That's stupid. But listen to him. He's sowing the seeds of like, Jon Jones is scared of Ngannou. This is all dirty negotiation tactics. But remember, Jon Jones was always ready, willing, and able. But now Jones is kind of scared, and he goes on to it a little bit more and says, does he really want to fight? He's talking about show me the money. Does he actually want to fight? You could say you want to fight, but do you really want to fight? I mean, this is typical Dana White. Just absolute bullshit.
You think that's a fight that you'd like to put together next? I mean, I know we don't matchmake, but that sure does seem exciting.
Listen, I could sit here all day and tell you, what show me the money mean? I tell you guys this all the time. If you can say you want to fight somebody, but do you really want to?
Yeah.
So you guys tell me. You could say you really want to fight someone, but do you really want to? Do you really want to, Jon Jones? You're talking about show me the money? Yeah, he's moving down to 185. So there you have it with the Jon Jones narrative. We're going to get to Francis Ngannou doesn't want to take any risks. We're going to hear some more of that in a second because I want to jump to when Francis Ngannou signed with the PFL. This was Dana White's reaction when he signed with the PFL. And this is like a 2.5, 3-minute clip I'm going to show you, but we're going to break it down in different parts, where Dana White just spews so much bullshit over and over and over again. And I want to remind you, a large portion of the MMA community, these Dana White sycophants, ate it up and regurgitated it. Whether it was, the MMA community on Twitter, whether it's other content creators, whether it's the MMA media, the mainstream MMA media, they regurgitated the shit. Nobody even pushed back ever. They always want to be on Daddy Dana's side. And then you have people like Chael Sonnen going out there and reinforcing these narratives. And then people are like, yeah, Chael's definitely hitting this perfectly. He's right. Let's listen to what he had to say after Francis Ngannou signed with PFL.
Based on what I know about the deal, which is not much, it makes no sense to me. I mean, you're going to pay a guy not to fight for a year, and it's already been like 18 months. He's fought 3 times in the last 3 years.
I'm sorry for pausing this already, but this shit just pisses me off. Dana White and the UFC were actively icing Francis Ngannou because they did not want him to fight out his deal. So they were delaying. And then now after the fact, he says, oh, he's fought 3 times in X amount of years. Remember that, right? Right? Let's listen to that one more time, because I'm actually going to make a point right here. I'm just going to jump right into it.
I mean, you're going to pay a guy not to fight for a year, and it's already been like 18 months. He's fought 3 times in the last 3 years.
3 times in the last 3 years. And he said this like this was such a horrible thing. 3 times in the last 3 years. Let's just take it at face value. Let's forget about the fact that Dana White and the UFC were icing Francis Ngannou when he's begging for fight after fight after fight publicly. Okay? Begging for these fights. He's fought 3 times in, X amount of years. You know what? That actually sounds awfully familiar. Let's take a look at Mr. Johnny Bones Jones, Mr. 27-1. Let's see how many fights he has, okay? So we have 1 fight in 2023. Okay, we have no fights in 2022. We have no fights in 2021, and then we have a fight in 2020. So in 4 years, in 4 total years, you have 2 fights from Jon Jones. But that doesn't stop Dana White from going around and just rimming Jon Jones left and right. Rimming him. And this was, there was a multitude of reasons for this. There was contract negotiations. There was potentially Jon Jones bulking up the heavyweight. But think about the way Dana has been acting about Jon Jones, that it's been pissing a lot of people off. This is a large portion of the MMA community's fault because they have co-signed Dana White acting like this for so long, and there's no consequences for it. He flips and flops and back and forth. Yeah, Francis has only fought this many times. What about Jones? What about Jones, the guy you keep hyping him up on every single podcast you go on and like, yeah, John Jones has got a dark side to him. Well, how many fights does he have? So let's just jump right back into it. Because there's way more to listen to.
It's just not what we do here. It's not what we do. And
I should have paused it right there and then made my point. It's just not what we do here. It's awfully funny. That's awfully funny, Dana, because you have an interim champion in Tom Aspinall who's been the champion going on damn near a year, and John Jones has fought once since February of 2020. And who's his next fight going to be against? Who's it going to be against? It's going to be against this guy. How many times has this guy fought, by the way? Old Stipe Miocic, Mr. Fire Department himself, answering phones at the fire department. How many fights does he have? Okay, nothing in 2023, nothing in 2022, nothing in 2020. Oh, wait, we got one in 2021. He's got one in 2021. And then he's got one in 2020. He's got one in 2019. He's got two in 2019. So since 2020, this is crazy. 2 fights since 2020. So you have 2 fighters combined 8 years, 4 total fights, fighting for a championship later this year. That's just not what we do here. And listen, I know Dana White and the recent behavior he's had about John Jones and, Stipe, and mainly just John Jones and kind of excluding Tom Aspinall, has pissed a lot of people off. But you co-signed it when he did it with Francis Ngannou. Everyone co-signed it then. Let's continue.
the day that we released him, I knew exactly what was going to happen. And Francis wants to take 0 risks. Doesn't want to take any chances.
Again, Francis doesn't want to take any chances. Remember that.
Obviously didn't want to take a chance against John Jones. And after we saw what happened with Cyril Gane, you know, I don't blame him. I think the outcome would have been exactly the same. And I'm sure most of you do, and I'm sure Francis does too.
This just further proves my point. And what I've been trying to say this entire time, what I've been alluding to this entire time, the fans went along with Dana White when he talked this way about Francis Ngannou. And he put down Francis Ngannou. And a lot of the fans were pissed because Francis Ngannou left the UFC because the UFC was treating him poorly. And we're going to watch Israel Adesanya call him out for that later in the video. But now you have set up a situation where Dana White is so desperate to erase the existence of Francis Ngannou. That is one of the main reasons that he is pushing John Jones so hard right now. He wants everyone to forget. You know, as soon as Jones beat Cyril Gane, look at him. He's like, you know, would it have been any differently? Who would have possibly even thought Francis would have had a chance against John Jones? So let me get this straight. The guy that folded Stipe Miocic like a lawn chair 3 years ago is irrelevant, definitely would have lost to John Jones, but the guy that got folded is now had sat out since that loss and now is going to get the next title shot. And you want us to buy that pay-per-view, by the way. You want us to buy that pay-per-view. Makes no sense. But let's carry on.
You know, and the media makes it sound like that I'm saying that he's afraid of him. Now, I don't think that he's afraid of anybody. It's just the fact that he doesn't want to take any risk. He doesn't
want to take any risk. You're saying he's scared of risk. He's risk adverse. So you're saying he's scared of him. You know,
PFL's going to pay this guy to train for a boxing match that may not even happen and that they might not even be involved in.
Keywords, they might not be involved in because Dana White, he wanted a cut of that if it were to happen, but he didn't even want to let him try or attempt it.
How does that make any sense? It doesn't make sense to me. I mean, Anthony Joshua called it a gimmick fight this week.
Do I need to even acknowledge that? Well, guess what? He ended up fighting Anthony Joshua. He may have lost, fair enough, but he stepped in there with one of the best heavyweight boxers in the world twice, one being Tyson Fury, the other being Anthony Joshua, and he's acting like, oh, this is so far-fetched. He's never going to do that. And he had Chael Sonnen out there pushing UFC propaganda as well.
You know, he when asked about that fight, he's like, I'm focused on fighting the best guys in the world. You know, I'm not interested in a gimmick fight right now. And that's one of the big problems with boxing right now is it's all about these gimmicky type fights. And that's just not what I do here. It's not what I do. I put on fights with the best fighters in the world and fights that people want to see.
Does anyone want to see John Jones, Stipe Miocic? I mean, to pull up this interview, I know this interview is over a year old, but to pull up this interview now and just know how I covered it back then. If you've been following my channel, you know I broke this down, the exact same situation back then. Look at, like, being able to look into the future now and knowing what our current state is of the UFC heavyweight division. Listen to this bullshit. We put on the fights the fans want to see. Nobody wants to see John Jones versus Stipe Miocic. Nobody.
Francis could have done a deal here. Hunter threw the kitchen sink at that guy, you know. Hunter went to more dinners with Francis Ngannou and did everything in his power to try to get this fight done.
Oh my God, he bought him dinners. Oh no.
And, you know, Francis just thinks like that he's in a position where he's got some Conor McGregor Mayweather fight on his hands, which he does not.
I know it wasn't Conor McGregor Mayweather level, but Francis Ngannou, Tyson Fury, Francis Ngannou, Anthony Joshua were pretty big fights. Could have made upwards of $30 to $40 million in both those fights. One of those fights, his purse from one of those fights was more than he made his entire career in the UFC. Entire career combined.
That fight was like a once-in-a-lifetime type deal. Fight that I wasn't very interested in. But at the end of the day, it became so big. The right guys, the right time, the right place. The fans wanted it. So we did it, and we got it done. MMA guys versus boxers doesn't make any sense to me. But I know that he thinks there's all this money in it. I disagree. I don't think there is. And I have no beef with the people.
So he doesn't think there's any money in it for Francis Ngannou. Francis Ngannou signed the biggest deal for a MMA heavyweight in the history of the sport with PFL, with all these different kind of incentives as well. He's fighting for the PFL later this year against Renan Fajeda. He had 2 boxing matches that elevated his star power, one against Tyson Fury, one against Anthony Joshua, made 30 to 40 million. You know, even if you want to go on the low end, he made 20 to 30 million. And yeah, it's not really out there and this and that. Imagine had Ngannou went and boxed Fury, arguably won, moral victory, came back and fought John Jones. It would have been the biggest fight in UFC history. The biggest fight in UFC history. Dana White fumbled the bag. Absolute disgrace. Now, I want to move on, but I want to look at one more Dana White clip. Remember, Dana said Francis doesn't want to take any risk, and he doesn't want to do this, and he thinks he has all this and that. Now, let's listen to him gloat and laugh after Ngannou got finished by Anthony Joshua and say, oh, yeah, we all knew that was going to happen. Well, wait a second. I don't think there's anything riskier than stepping in a ring or a cage with the possibility to be KO'd, especially in a sport you've barely competed in, aka boxing, for Francis Ngannou. But listen to him with this shit-eating grin and laughing up a storm, and the MMA media members like, yeah, it was one of the more violent KOs. Like, damn, stroke Dana White hard enough. These MMA media members are fucking clowns. Fucking clowns, I'm telling you.
And the Francis fight.
What do you mean? What did I make?
Yeah,
what did I make of it?
What you saw, like, it was. People are saying it's one of the more violent knockouts in boxing history.
Yeah, I mean.
By the way, he never really talked about the Fury fight. After the Fury fight happened, Dana was radio silent. He made like a statement on a podcast where he barely talked about it, and then no media ever asked him about it. Never got a real statement. This was only months later after he got chinned by Anthony Joshua.
Going into the Fury fight, if Fury trained for the fight and didn't show up and, you know, look like he ate Tyson Fury, it's probably the way that fight would have ended too. I mean, listen, the crossover, you know how I feel about crossovers into boxing, and that's...
So there you go. It should have happened against Fury too. Well, wait a second. I thought he didn't want to take any risk. I think getting flatlined by 2 heavyweight boxers, elite heavyweight boxers, would be a massive risk. Okay? So Dana already has a history of spewing bullshit about Francis Ngannou because he does not like Francis Ngannou, because these guys are egomaniacs. They can't stand when a fighter stands up to them. And Francis Ngannou stood up to them and stood, you know, just basically unbreakable by the UFC. He didn't allow them to manipulate them. And he was more about principle than anything. And he went out there and he succeeded. And Dana White and the UFC are so salty about this because Francis has been a trailblazer for other fighters to potentially follow in his footsteps. And I don't mean the same exact path that he went, but what I mean is they realize, well, wait a second, there is a real possibility of leaving the UFC and still having success in combat sports. It's not going to work for everyone, okay? Francis Ngannou is a very specific case, but Dana and the UFC are pissed about that, and they are pissed that Francis Ngannou had success post-UFC. And you can even go back in time, and you can look at this right here. That was never really acknowledged. Look who's wrapping the belt around Francis Ngannou after he defeats Cyril Gane. Do you see Dana White in this cage? Look at, I think this is Mick Maynard, matchmaker Mick Maynard. He literally looks like he just got a call that someone in his family died. Now, okay, this is just a still, whatever. Dana White stormed out of the arena when he saw Francis Ngannou win the title. He was praying that Cyril Gane was going to win. And even recently, he's let it out that, yeah, if Cyril Gane didn't go for that heel hook, he would have won the title. But now what you have is Francis Ngannou on a torn ACL, defeats Cyril Gane, then John Jones comes in. Francis defeats him by decision, hard-fought decision. Jones comes in and submits Cyril Gane in the first round, which gave Dana White, which emboldened Dana White to kind of pull out MMA math and say, look what Jones did to Gane. Look how Francis looked against Gane, and just glazed John Jones. And because of all this, and a lot of fans were with him, he's gotten away with this. And now look at the heavyweight division. We all hate it. So you guys have to start questioning Dana White more. He's full of shit. And imagine how much better the division would have been if they would have just found a way to work it out with Francis Ngannou instead of trying to bully him. But it all started right here. Look, they're pissed. And he never fought in the UFC again after this. Never fought in again. Now, we have some more instances of them treating Francis Ngannou poorly. More recently, you have Tafon Nchukwi, I believe is how you pronounce his name. He walked out on a fight card. And look at this graphic they put up. Only Cameroonian fighter in UFC history. Is that just an error? Or is that a slight at Francis Ngannou? And there's another Cameroonian fighter that fought in the UFC before as well. I forgot what his name is. But only Cameroonian fighter in UFC history. If that isn't a slight at Francis Ngannou, I don't know what is. And we haven't even gotten to UFC 305 countdowns yet. Or Israel Adesanya's comment finally calling them out. And then we get into the UFC 305 countdown. So just to be very clear, this is the UFC 305 countdown, and it is some clips from the press conference for UFC 305. We're going to compare this to the actual UFC 305 press conference. So you already have the graphic of only Cameroonian fighter in UFC history, and now you're going to have this UFC countdown. Listen to what Israel Adesanya says here, and then we're going to compare it to what he actually said in reality.
There's always going to be tension there. But then him discrediting me, Kamaru Usman, he came in the UFC. I knew who he was a little bit, but I didn't go, oh, who the f is this?
So again, we're just going to listen to this one more time. He says, you just hear Israel Adesanya mention Kamaru Usman.
There's always going to be tension there. But then him discrediting me, Kamaru Usman, he came in the UFC. I knew who he was a little bit, but I didn't go, oh, who the f is this fake dude coming in?
So there you hear it. He says Kamaru Usman. He only says me and Kamaru Usman. Well, let's compare it to the actual UFC press conference because that's not what he said. And I'm going to play a little bit longer of this because this will not get me copyright because this is just the press conference here, not the actual countdown video. But listen to what Israel Adesanya actually said at the press conference.
Yeah, and also, again, he tried to discredit the Three Kings and say that he's the real true African champion. And I was just like, it's a weird mindset, bro. Like, he came in the UFC. I knew who he was a little bit, but I didn't go, oh, who the fuck's this fake dude coming in? So cool, there's another African in the UFC. But then him discrediting me, Francis Ngannou, Kamaru Usman, that ticked me off a little bit. So that's what started this.
So the UFC had to go out of their way to edit Francis Ngannou's name out of the countdown. They switched it around a little bit. But that's just ridiculous, man. They're going to use this whole African narrative to build up this fight and sell pay-per-views, but they're like, I'll be damned if Francis Ngannou's name is mentioned in a countdown. He's fighting for PFL now. He doesn't want to take any risk. I just think it's petty and it's ridiculous, especially when you take into account everything Francis Ngannou did in the UFC. And I know people are going to be like, well, he only defended the belt once, Joey. Yeah, but look at his resume, guys. First off, 11 KOs out of 17 fights, okay? 11 KOs out of 17 fights, 16 finishes out of 17 fights. He's only been to decision once, and that was against, in terms of wins, and that was against Ciryl Gane. So you look at his resume, beat Ciryl Gane on a torn ACL, brutally KO'd Stipe Miocic, brutally KO'd Jairzinho Rozenstruik, brutally KO'd Junior Dos Santos, brutally KO'd Cain Velasquez, brutally KO'd Curtis Blades, lost a nothing decision against Derek Lewis. Literally nothing happened in that fight. Nobody actually won that fight. Lost to Stipe Miocic in his first title shot. Then you look at the rest of his resume, Alistair Overeem when he was still decent, Andrei Arlovsky, and then you get down to kind of the beginning of his resume. This is a phenomenal resume of who's who in the UFC heavyweight division, and they're just acting like he didn't exist, all because the UFC treated him like shit and he decided to stand on principle and leave the UFC for a better opportunity. Completely utterly ridiculous. And what annoys me so much is now you have these two clowns, Jon Jones and Stipe Miocic, who don't even fight. And now we got to watch them fight for the heavyweight title. So it's just completely and utterly ridiculous. Well, I'm assuming Israel Adesanya saw that the UFC edited this out, and he decided to call it out in an ESPN interview, staring dead into the camera and basically telling the UFC, look, you can't erase what Francis Ngannou has done. You cannot erase what Francis has done. I mean, how can you erase this? How can you? I mean, Stipe got folded like a lawn chair. You going to play that highlight when he fights Jon Jones? He hasn't won in four. This guy hasn't won in 4 years, boys. 4 years, and this is the guy who's getting a title shot. Nobody who ever ends up in this position ever should ever fight for a title in the UFC. Ever. I don't care what anyone says. Especially not when this was the position you were in your very last fight. Especially when it was almost 4 years ago. That's insanity. But anyway, Israel Adesanya calls him out. Let's listen to Israel Adesanya call out the UFC. I don't think Dana White's going to be happy about this.
Three kings, not only yourself this week, but also Francis and Kamaru.
Francis and Kamaru, 100%. These are guys that we have paved the way for people like Dricus. We've paved the way for a whole continent to be able to dream, to be able to know, man, I can get there. And I've said this before, and I'll say it again. Look, it doesn't end with us. It doesn't even end with Dricus. Wait for the next generation of African fighters from South Africa, from Cameroon, from Nigeria, from Sierra Leone, from...
So now he's getting ready to call him out for saying, basically trying to erase Francis Ngannou from UFC history.
Ghana. They're going to show up in the next few years, and then you'll see, oh, shit, everybody take a back seat. The Africans are here.
Have they been in contact, Izzy? Any well wishes from either of them?
Of course. Definitely. Like, you know, they're my brothers. They always wish me well, and they always support me in what we do, and I always support them as well. And also, you can never erase Francis' history from the UFC.
And he goes on a little bit more here.
I'll say that. It's part of history. We need to fix this. I don't like that. I don't like the fact we're trying to just cut out a really important part of history. It's silly. It's really silly. But we'll fix that. That's for later on. We'll fix that.
We know you.
I love it. I absolutely love it. I mean, to stand up for Francis Ngannou when everyone's scared of the big bad UFC, Israel Adesanya just stares into the camera and calls him out. You can't erase this guy from history. I mean, look what he's done. People act like you can just toss Francis Ngannou to the wayside, like he isn't one of the greatest heavyweights of all time, and I'll stand on that. I know people will say, oh, one title defense. Look at his resume, which I've already gone through.
You can never erase Francis' history from the UFC. I'll say that. It's part of history. We need to fix this. I don't like that. I don't like the fact we're trying to just cut out a really important part of history. It's silly. It's really silly, but we'll fix that. That's for later on. We'll fix that.
I guess he thinks he's going to try to mend fences between Ngannou and Dana White. Never going to happen. Dana White, if you walked up to Dana White and you said, look, you'll never erase Francis Ngannou from UFC history, Dana White would look Israel Adesanya dead in the eyes and say, Jon Jones has got a dark side to him. He shoots guns. He's got two German Shepherds. He smacks spray paint cans out of teenagers' hands who are out, graffitiing up the town during unrest. He's got a dark side to him. If you go into a room with Jon Jones is coming out. That's what Dana White would respond to Israel Adesanya with. So they're never going to mend fences. Dana White is a complete and utter egomaniac. And I am so happy that Israel Adesanya called him out because it's ridiculous. And nobody really talks about it. And what drives me nuts is Dana White pushes all this bullshit for years. fans go along with it. And at least to the extent that I could, I called this out at every turn. I covered this extensively. I called it out at every turn. But most of the time, I'm looking into the future with educated guesses. Now we have the benefit of being able to live in the present and see how wrong Dana White was back then with having all the information we have now and today, right before UFC 305. We could see that it was all horseshit. And for all the fans who rolled with the narrative that Francis was scared of John Jones, or Francis fumbled the bag, or Francis is irrelevant, or Francis has no legacy, all because Daddy Dana White told you to, or Chael Sonnen told you to, realize today's heavyweight division is on you. Because you allowed Dana White to get by with this bullshit. It's been horseshit. And now you have a heavyweight division where you have John Jones, who's fought once since February of 2020, versus Stipe Miocic, who hasn't won a fight in 4 years. In 4 years. I mean, seriously, I have to pull this up one more time just because I cannot believe it. August 15th, tomorrow, I'm recording this on August 14th. Tomorrow will be exactly 4 years, 1 day away from exactly 4 years since Stipe Miocic got a win. And if you look at Stipe Miocic's resume, you know what I notice here? Not a single one of these fighters are on the current UFC roster. And this guy is getting a title shot. And Dana White's selling those wolf tickets. Shout out to Israel Adesanya for calling it out. Shout out to Adesanya for standing up for his friend in Francis Ngannou. Because someone should do it. Someone should. The MMA media is not going to do it. A lot of the Dana White sycophants aren't going to do it. I'm glad that Israel Adesanya did it. Gave me an opportunity to make this video. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Don't forget to like the video. Don't forget to subscribe. And thank you so much for watching.